This chapter discusses the vector synthesis, setup, and master effects sections found in the advanced page of Xphraze. To access the advanced features of Xphraze, click on the Advanced button next to the keyboard. The vector synthesis, once enabled, controls the amplitude balance between the 4 patch slots in a combi. The A, B, C, and D boxes correspond to these slots. The center position in the graphic display represents Xphraze's default setting where all 4 slots have an equal place in the mix. The value represented by the number 25 above each slot letter corresponds to a mix percentage. The numbers displayed inside the graphic display represents the timeline's point number. By dragging the handles in the graphic display away from the center, you can see that there is one handle for each point in the timeline envelope below. The timeline determines at which point in time the mix between each slot in the vector synthesis changes. To add points in the timeline, double-click where you want the point to occur. Double-click on an existing point to remove it. You can drag a point in the timeline, but you can't move the point vertically since this has no effect on the vector synthesis section anyway. You can also navigate and zoom within the timeline using the same mouse actions as with any other envelope discussed in Chapter 8. Once you've created points in the timeline, you can drag the corresponding handles where you want them in the graphical display. When selecting a handle, you will notice that its point becomes full, which makes it easier to know when, in time, this change in the mix will occur. The loop functions in the vector synthesis are also identical to other envelopes discussed. For example, the loop button toggles between forward loop, backward loop, and off. You set the loop area by dragging the start and end point in the timeline display. If you turn off the sync mode button, the timeline will display time values rather than bars and beats. To further transform the mix between different slots in a combi generated by the vector synthesis graph, Xphraze offers you the possibility of assigning the LFOs found in slot A to the current vector trace. Let's illustrate this by an example to better understand the potential. The Mix A-B section offers 2 controls that will influence the position between the A and B slots. By increasing the LFO1 depth knob, the LFO's waveform is applied to the current vector. A greater depth will play a greater influence on the vector. The LFO's rate, depth, phase, smoothness, and waveform will influence how the vector is transformed. By applying the LFO3 to the same A-B mix, you add an additional variable to the transformation of the vector's path. The mix C and D controls will affect the vector in a similar way, with the exception that the path between slots C and D will be influenced, and that the LFO used for this control are numbers 2 and 4 from slot A always. The setup section gives you a few interesting performance options. Since with all things computer related, processing power and resources are not commodities you usually have too much of, the quality setting lets you downgrade the resampling quality of Xphraze. Resampling occurs whenever a sample is triggered by a note different than the one the sample was recorded at. Since Xphraze uses multi-samples, resampling always occurs. By lowering the resampling frequency, you can reduce the processing load on the computer during the production process. Once you're done editing, You can either return the quality to a higher level before rendering Xphraze parts to an audio file in your project, or check the Use Best Quality for Export option. The number of voices also influences the performance of Xphraze inside your application by restricting the number of simultaneous voices it will play. You can type in the number of voices you wish to set as the limit for Xphraze, or drag the mouse up or down until you hit the safe number of voices. This number will vary from computer to computer depending on its processing speed and the project load at hand. A safe number to start with is 64 voices. If you need more voices and your computer can handle it, you can raise this to a maximum of 1024 voices. The Save Samples with Patches option lets you save samples you use to create custom multi-samples. When you save a patch with this option, the multi-samples are saved with it, allowing you to use your custom patches on different projects and other computers. Through the Xmix function, you can remote control certain parameters of Xphraze using a keyboard, making live performances a little bit easier when you want to change a phrase buffer or turn a patch on or off during a show. For example, you set the Xmix channel to any MIDI channels between 5 and 16, since 1 through 4 are reserved for patches. Once set, when Xphraze receives a C1 note from your keyboard on this MIDI channel, it enables slot A. Pressing C#1 will disable it. You can also change phrase buffers using this channel in a live setting, or program your phrase buffer changes by inserting a note on event corresponding to the desired phrase buffer for slots A through D. You'll find a list of all key assignments in Xphraze's documentation. Xmode will transform the G, A, B, and C notes from the selected root octave field for the enabled slots into phrase buffer switches. Let's say you have a 5-octave keyboard and would like to use the last 4 notes in the upper register of your keyboard as a phrase buffer switch. Enable the desired slots, select the G5 octave as your root, and play the corresponding phrase buffer switch when needed. For obvious reasons, these 4 keys will stop producing notes for the enabled slots. The ELF or ELF button lets you introduce variables in the timing of Xphraze, which gives it a more organic, less machine-like feel. ELF stands for Enhanced Live Feel, and the button doesn't offer any additional parameters since it is already programmed to give you the best result out of the subtle changes it brings to the timing, pitch, lengths, and other parameters within Xphraze. The Master Effects section offers 4 additional effects, such as reverb, delay, chorus, and so on. These effects can be added to a patch as a second effect after the effects section. Master effects, however, can be modulated through a modulation source, and each effect is associated to its own output. In other words, Effect 1 will affect patches assigned to output 1. Effect 2 will affect patches assigned to output 2, and so on. So by assigning patches in slots A through D to outputs 1 through 4, you get 2 effects per patch, giving you that extra sonic juice to savor. For example, enabling a comb filter in the effects section and a stereo delay in the master effect to create some forward motion in a phrase. To use a master effect, enable it. The link button lets you link the values of both channels. Changing one will change the other. Choose the type of effect you wish to apply in the type field. For example, if you want to control the dynamic range of the patches assigned to output 1, you can set the type to stereo compressor. The parameters displayed will always be associated with the selected type. In this example, the threshold, the speed of attack and release, and the ratio of compression. The mix dial controls how much of the effect you wish to apply. As you can see, these seemingly hidden functions can be quite useful to create performances live or in studio. The vector synthesis can create beautiful textures while shaving loads of time recording automation to get the equivalent effect. Finally, it's worth taking a look at the effect type descriptions in Xphraze's documentation. Abbreviations are not always easy to understand if you're not familiar with what the parameters do.